I was born August 23, 1919, in Vienna, Austria. My father, Franz Xaver Frisch, a bank officer, died when I was 10. My mother, Margaret Frisch-Paradeiser, a high school teacher for more than 40 years, raised me in Vienna. On my father's side, he was a descendant of Hungarians active in banking and early industrial management. My father worked in banking according to his family tradition, but was otherwise an ultra-liberal intellectual, with the cynical humour of Werfel and other liberals of the Vienna circle of the post-Enlightenment. Nothing was safe from his wit and sarcasm, except his deep commitment to family and his conscience. His father, so the story went, spoke not only fluent Hungarian, as well as German and French, but also Latin, classical Greek and Hebrew, the result of many years of education in a Jesuit seminary. After his time, the education level of the family rather deteriorated. My mother was a descendant of an old line of impoverished Austrian aristocracy mixed with wealthy burghers. For generations they provided high government servants of absolute devotion to the Habsburg crown, with inbred arrogance and complete lack of humour. She taught by choice mostly in the poorest districts of the city, and saw no contradiction between deep Christian religiosity, the ideals of Maria Stotner and Coudenhove-Kalergi, and the humanistic aspirations of social democracy. In my formative years, I grew up under what I thought was the fascinating auspices of the Christian Austro-fascism of Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss and Minister Kurt von Schuschnigg, and studied philosophy and political economy with eagerness. I took these studies far beyond the make-my hobby of that time, tinkering with technical toys, into my profession. My youthful dream of studying law as well as engineering and economics was only a partial success, at least as far as paper credentials were concerned. Following completion of gymnasium, high school, and the forced unification, Anschluss, of Austria with Germany, I was then volunteered to participate for 7 years in the 1,000-year empire of Adolf Hitler. My military service culminated in 2 seemingly unending years spent in an American prisoner of war camp in Italy. I returned home in 1947 to start my life over. Those 9 years provided me with a unique opportunity for applied psychological studies in human behaviour under stress, of winners and losers, about hopes and fears. While some of my comrades in arms considered our campaigns in Poland, France, the Soviet Union, Belarus and Russia, Sicily and Italy, either as a patriotic duty or a bore, I considered them an outstanding travel experience, the purpose of which was to study people, culture and languages. This, I considered, was presumably the privilege of an outsider and nut such as myself. Long before then, I wanted to be an engineer. As long as the Austrian army existed, before unification, I wanted to be an army engineer officer. To be an engineer officer would have corresponded with family aspirations. My mother's brother tried to convince me that the only value of study was law, and that engineering was not sufficiently dignified. Engineering was always my interest, and my aversion against law originated when they told me I must do it. As it was, I never counted with the German army, and never counted with the war. I was drafted into the army in 1938 at age 19, along with many school and neighbourhood friends. We entered service in the all-Viennese House Artillery Regiment 109. By tradition, this house regiment belonged to the city of Vienna. I began as a private soldier, a simple soldier of the German army, and remained at that rank and servitude throughout my service. Some 46 years later, with reluctance and uneasiness, I agreed to tell the story of those 9 years. I had never done this before, not even to my family. I had held my thoughts inside, those I had not purposely discarded. I am basically a bit schüchtern, or reserved. Perhaps it was the way my colleague, Wilbur Jones, whom I respected as a professor and historian, approached me that changed my mind. Then I did not know who might be interested in reading about my war experiences, but I realized this would be my only opportunity ever to speak for the record. Hereafter follows some remembrances of those 9 years of service to the Wehrmacht, and some photographs to prove I was there. I would have taken more, but we simple soldiers could not get film after the summer of 1943. I was often diverted from sightseeing by calls to action, particularly as we were retreating, so I am almost without photos for Sicily and Italy, and none for the American camp. Anyway, I lost the camera I used, an American Kodak box camera, and I had nearly forgotten what it looked like until Jones found one in an antique shop in Upper Michigan and gave it to me. I know that uncovering the photographs, which I had long ignored, made me more determined than ever to speak. During my service I kept no diary and later found no letters, but my memory remains clear in spite of reluctance to think of these things for so long. As evidence, I found I repeated similar stories at different sittings during interviews. The photographs helped me remember, as did the questions of my inquisitor, Wilbur. He did remarkable in-depth research on my campaigns and those areas where I might have been so he could understand better what I was discussing. Translating my unit's records from German forced me to recollect. I conclude these remembrances with a capsule of what little I have accomplished since 1947, the most notable being my fortune in settling in the United States. I am glad this is all out in the open. I am much relieved of this burden of many years. I have always perceived a great reluctance on the part of soldiers of the losing sides to talk about what they went through. But now I wish to share it with my family, colleagues, historians, and other interested readers in hopes of providing them with a clearer picture of what life as a German soldier was like. Let me say that first and foremost I fought only to survive. Of course, I also fought for my country, as every good soldier must, but nothing was ever more important to me than survival. The rank-and-file private simple soldier in the German army in World War II was called an Einfacher Soldat, which was approximately the same as a G.I. Joe American common soldier. For 9 years I always stayed a private. The main reason, I believed, was not my performance or my conduct, but that I had certain political baggage on the family side. Before army service, I was a member of the International Boy Scouts, very much engaged with the Catholics, fascism, and Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss. The group I was associated with had pledged allegiance to the anti-Nazi Dollfuss. This, for the Nazis, was the same as being a communist in the United States at that time. Therefore, I entered the army with a bad political record, and I wasn't very eager to repair it, certainly not to give in to the Nazi interpretations. To remain a private was almost preordained. Of course, at the beginning I never thought service would take 9 years of my life. I was thinking, okay, I have 2 years and then it's over, and then forget this shit. It certainly developed differently. My family had served well in World War I for Austria. My father was a soldier before he got sick and was discharged. Both of my mother's brothers were officers. One was captured in Russia and was in a prison camp in Vladivostok, and the other was on the Italian front. So I suppose it was natural that I did my duty for my country. Compared to the way I look today, army service actually changed me physically very little. I am now 5'6", about the same as in the war. I was around 160 pounds during the war, not far from my weight today, although placed differently. As a motorized soldier, I always rode in a vehicle and never marched anywhere. The exceptions were in 1942, after we were withdrawn from the Russian front, when I marched during training in Czechoslovakia, and in the closing weeks walking north before I was captured. I was proud to be a motorized soldier. After the campaign in Poland, everyone talked about the overwhelming success of our blitzkrieg attack, and I figured it had to be our intense, detailed training as motorized soldiers paying off. Even though I entered the German army, here, with my hometown friends in a homogeneous artillery unit, a characteristic that struck me soon about the army was what we today would call its diversity. Starting with basic training, a unit emphasized absolute geographic, social, and educational mix. People recognized each other and sought to be at certain comfort levels, and pretty soon you had subgroups which stayed together for socializing, entertainment, and for various other reasons. There were certain groups who visited the bordellos, and other groups who tried to stay away and entertain themselves differently, reading, playing chess, and so forth. The German army was a melting pot, if it can be called that, which crossed the entire social and economic strata. We heard different dialects, but the more the unit got mixed, the more subsided the dialects. The advantage of this is the men learned to understand the different dialects and started to learn the true German language the first time. As my German friends would say, even us Austrians. Common German thus developed. When I was young, you could drive 50 miles away, and you almost couldn't understand the people. This in Germany and Austria is gone today completely. Vulgar and foul language was used probably about the same as in every army, but especially so when my unit was under heavy counter-battery fire in Russia and Italy. At the beginning in 1938, our unit members were all Austrians. This is characteristic of a so-called house or home regiment. Every city had its own regiment. Vienna had a few house regiments, infantry, artillery, with only Viennese people. Germany had the same thing, such as Bavarian house regiments, etc. During the war, my unit became more and more mixed with replacement soldiers. In the end, no two house regiments were left in the German army. Recruits or draftees were called into service in about September 1938. I entered 1st Battery, 1st Battalion, Artillery Regiment 109. We were located in the Vienna Kaserne, or compound, called the Arsenal. The regiment's other two batteries were located in different buildings, and there was no communication among us. All three batteries were in Poland, France, and Russia from the beginning, and all three lost almost everything in the glorious 1941 winter offensive to conquer Moscow. Whatever our title, my unit was never permanently assigned to another larger organization like a division. We were called Heeres Artillery, or Army Artillery, and were shifted around periodically to a corps or division requiring immediate artillery help. We were never permanently assigned. The Americans would call such assignment system dedicated or organic, like a fire engine being sent to fight a fire, or as we soldiers said, where it stinks. Thus we were called the Fire Engine Battalion. Permanent reorganizations and unit name changes escaped the simple soldier, and ours had a number of them, but we remained essentially Heeresgruppe on special assignments. My artillery regiment, therefore, was a paper organization, and seldom deployed as a complete unit, but rather as detachments. Consequently, as a lowly private taking orders from corporals and sergeants, I did not always know who were the generals above us. So it is difficult for me to reconstruct exactly alongside whom we were fighting, or what commander we were attached to in many situations. I do recall a few division and corps level echelons we were assigned to for certain campaigns. One that sticks out most prominently was being with the 1st Panzer Division of Major General Heinz Guderian's corps in the invasion of France, when we chased the Allies all the way to Dunkirk. In reality, as I translated the event table in the sourcebook The German Government Accounting of the Wehrmacht Units, I thought how counter the organizational changes were to the myth of German organization talent. For instance, to start a revolution in an organization, the revolutionaries must trust each other, and this takes time. If they are shifted around, no trust among them will exist, and no revolution will take place. Such an analogy would apply in our case. For whatever we were trying to accomplish, continuity of command and organization was definitely lacking. This uncertainty caused some confusion and mixed signals, and except for our immediate peers, who were prone to get along reasonably well together, did not enhance morale. Our job was to provide artillery support for the panzers, the tanks, and armoured and motorised infantry. Those two echelons advanced ahead of us. We were in the Thigh-RD echelon, sometimes on the front, most of the time a kilometre or two right behind it. Unlike most German field artillery units, which used horses to pull their weapons, ammunition, and support equipment, our guns and equipment were towed by trucks, usually the half-tracked Krauss-Maffei. We crew members in the battery rode in the trucks or in Steyr staff cars, which had a convertible kind of top. Most of the time the gun we used was the 10-centimetre artillery cannone, or cannon, with a maximum range of 21 kilometres. Sometimes we had the 15-centimetre haubitzer, or howitzer, which could reach 15 kilometres. Both guns used the same chassis and the same tractor. For battery spirit, before the Russian campaign, we devised a new identification symbol for our unit. It consisted of an Austrian Wappen, or crest, with a cross and the one outline of Vienna's St. Stephan's Cathedral on it. We placed it on the rear of our vehicles to the right of the license plate. My original battery contained approximately 200 officers and enlisted men. Artillery Battalion 109. It was never a regiment. We had the title, but it was only a battalion, had altogether 800 men. We were reconstituted, reformed and reinforced in Brno, Czechoslovakia, after the first Russian winter, and received lots of new recruits for basic training, but with no guns. We troops from 109 were the only unit with field experience training there. After training, 109 was broken up into two parts. The group of 109 that I was with was assigned for transfer to the Africa Corps, the other part back to the Russian front as a new unit. Very unfortunately, the unit going to Russia was butchered along with the 6th Army at Stalingrad in 1942 to 1943, and only a few men survived. After Stalingrad, something like approximately 95,000 went into the Soviet prison camps, and I think only approximately 4,000 came out. I lost many friends, and later considered myself extremely lucky to be in Sicily, waiting for the Americans' invasion we knew would come. I adjusted quickly and easily to army life by learning the rules, and even at a youthful age to keep eyes and ears open and mouth shut. I got along very well with my enlisted comrades. We seldom had time to go into local towns for recreation time, and ended up writing letters daily and drinking a lot. Beer and wine were usually available, especially in France, but not at all in Russia. As long as it was available to those of us learning how to drink, if you are never completely sober, even a war can be fun. The German army was very eager to establish entertainment centers, which in plain English are called whorehouses. I heard the American army wouldn't do things like this, not officially anyway. In the German army, a man had to get a certificate for a prophylactic injection after exposure. He had to check into the medical office, which might deter some anxious boys. If somebody got sick or something, like with venereal disease, and did not have a certificate, he went to jail. If he had a certificate, of course it was not his fault. There were rules and regulations for every conceivable situation, and we had to know them all and adhere to them. Me? I just enjoyed the beer and wine and played a lot of chess. We had in our group a junior master chess player from somewhere in Yugoslavia. His German was not very good, but his chess game was fantastic. Slowly and surely we put together by coincidence a little group which permanently played chess, and in this group rank didn't matter. We just enjoyed the chess games. The relationships I had with my officers and non-commissioned officers were mostly careful and correct and depended upon their personalities. But overall, I was confident in them personally. I did not draw attention to myself or rock the boat, and thus avoided extremes one way or another. Discipline got more and more relaxed as the war went along, when we all lost some of our confidence. When it comes to military leadership, like everywhere, I found all types of people. In Italy, once I was assigned as cartographer to the artillery battalion command post. There I made some good observations of our leaders. They included Type 1, the activist, left every day early in the morning to inspect the batteries. Found everything okay because he forgot that the telephone announcing his visit was much faster than his car. Type 2, the big mouth. Never left his command post or bunker. Talked permanently on the phone with the battery commanders. Knew everything they wanted to tell him. Was a human zero. Type ill, the human being. A most marvelous man. Whenever the situation got serious, he showed up, calmed the nerves down. Everybody trusted him and respected him. He got shot in an accident by a sentry in a rest area when he walked around during the night with his dog. He was a major from the Africa Corps with the Ritterkreuz, Knight's Cross medal. I think all human characteristics like leadership, humanity, intelligence, not learned appearances, have a normal distribution, independent of rank, grade, and other attributes. In other words, no human being is perfect, neither on the positive or negative side. Not all officers are geniuses, and not all enlisted soldiers are drones. The healthcare in the German army, I say this now in retrospect, was pretty good. We had in every battalion one medical doctor plus sanitary personnel. If I felt bad, I had no problem turning myself in for sick call and was not restrained. I never was real sick or on light duty. I maintained my health rather well. We tried to take care of ourselves as much as we could and aided each other. The health of the soldiers, except for hopeless situations such as the winter we were before Moscow, was mostly good in the German army. I would say our medical care was typical European, a Western style. The government provided soldiers with eyeglasses. I wore glasses and attached them by a band or wrap around my ears to hold them on, and carried a spare set in my pack. We had minimal eye and dental care. Like many of my comrades, I smoked whenever I could get cigarettes. Privates could not obtain cigars, but some smoked pipes, although I never did. I didn't get the flu, only a bad cold from time to time, because I smoked too much. The only bad disease breakout happened in Russia in 1941, when most of us came down with diarrhea. There, the local unsanitary conditions were a factor, and the quality and frequency of food we got at the front were questionable. The other time we faced that situation in extreme was when we began heading north of the Gothic Line in Italy. Diarrhea couldn't care less about rank, intelligence, or attributes. I had it for a few days. An example of healthcare was during the Russian campaign in December 1941, when I got frostbite in my right leg while driving a motorcycle during the retreat. My leg froze a little bit, not too much, but just enough to be recognized and requiring treatment. I turned myself into the hospital about 3 weeks before Christmas and was not alone. So many thousands of German soldiers were incapacitated by frostbite and the cold. Medical personnel did the best they could and were happy not to be on the front lines. For me, the frostbite meant I was sent home to recuperate. In time, I knew I cheated the Russian winter, but it may have saved my life. While at home recuperating, I got my first vacation to study 1 semester at the Technical University in Vienna. I was very lucky. It was a nice break, even while recovering from that medical problem. It was my first time at the university, where I ultimately got my degree, a very interesting and very beautiful but brief experience. At that time, the part of Artillery Regiment 109 I was assigned to was somewhere in Germany, having returned from the front. A new unit was organized for the Africa Corps and was being trained for African duty, and I was told to report to it after recovering. Later, in Naples, Italy, in 1942, I got the jaundice and was sent home again to recover. I therefore attended my second semester at the university in the winter of 1942 to 1943. After my leave, I travelled by train and joined my new unit in Sicily. German soldiers usually received home leave or furloughs, vacations, once a year for 2 weeks. During campaigns, we were not allowed to have furloughs. In 1942, I went home on leave twice, the second time for 3 months, and once again in February 1945 for 2 weeks to get Ma ride. The army paid for our way home and back, and we would ride the trains whenever possible. From France, we went between the campaigns in France and the Soviet Union. We were treated very well at home because everybody was in the same boat. There was in no way discrimination, nothing like Vietnam when American soldiers returned home. The universities stayed open even though the student count was extremely low. Soldiers like me filled student seats temporarily and periodically. The professors, employees of the government, were mostly excused from military service, especially in the technical areas and in medicine. I don't know how it was in the humanistic area. Technical professors were allowed to stay, and were a part of what we would call the defense industry. The initiator of this command to study was, so the rumor went, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. He somehow determined that Germany would not have enough engineers and medical doctors after the great victory, the Endsieg, final victory, almost at hand. Therefore, thanks to this strategic error in judgment, but fortunate error in my favour, he ordered that candidates with proven interests in those 2 disciplines should start their studies at government expense. I can also naively assume he did not know the truth or refused to recognise its significance from the front, like when the German army started, upon Hitler's order, the last offensive of the war in the winter 1941, with the goal to capture Moscow and end the war in the east, all before the snows would come. On leave, we soldiers had to have special permission to wear civilian clothes, so we did not have to run around in uniform. Otherwise, we had to wear uniforms even at the university. At home, all were permitted to wear civilian clothes, but never wore civilian clothes on campaign. It was a privilege saved for vacations. Most soldiers tried to get rid of the uniforms on vacation to feel like normal human beings. This, of course, was impossible, as many men returned to cities suffering destruction from Allied bombing, although in my case Vienna was not in bad shape. Other than serious rationing and other belt-tightening impositions, the Vienna city life was about as normal as one could expect during wartime. After leave, we either went back to our unit in the field or stayed at home. To return was what our orders stated and our sense of duty demanded. Any decision to stay home and try to hide meant that if we got caught, we were dead for certain. Men I knew, therefore, went back to our unit very carefully for survival. A German soldier went back to the front to fight simply because going forward gave him some sort of chance for survival. Going backwards, to Germany or Austria, was pretty certain the end of life. There was the old saying, "You have to have more fear from your superior than from your enemy." The SS saw to it. The superiors were afraid to get shot too, right up the line. With the war obviously lost by February 1945, after my marriage I had trouble finding my unit in northern Italy. They were closer to Austria than when I had left them. Some railroads were still running, but they were under frequent attack from aircraft. There was always confusion. Occasionally I found a truck, but I ended up on foot. I knew approximately where my unit was supposed to be, but communications were poor. Strange enough, the army's organization started to break down in the rear. The closer I came to the front, the better it was. I would have figured on the reverse situation. The organization at the front only broke down on purpose when General Heinrich von Vietinghoff-Scheel and General Karl Wolff capitulated to the Americans in Switzerland in March. Up to this point, there was some nature of orderliness in the front lines, and I wish to pay tribute to the heart and courage of the German soldiers. Like soldiers everywhere, we lived to get mail from home. We got mail fairly regularly, from home to front in 2 to 3 weeks. My girlfriend wrote me, my mother wrote me. To my knowledge, mail was not censored by the authorities, except in the experience I relate later in this chapter. But we never knew, and the fear limited what we would say. We hesitated to bother people at home with details, bad as they were, because no one at home could do anything about it. The letters to us were mostly very short, very personal. "We are healthy, don't worry about us, we love you, we pray for you." Mostly they tried to keep bad news away from us. We had a good idea what they were going through. Stories told by men who had been on leave were enough. In the German army there was a saying, "Alles Scheiße, deine Ellie." Everything is shit, your Ellie. Ellie was the name of the girl who wrote Your Ellie, whatever her real name. For some reason, I never collected or sent home any local or war souvenirs. Commanders at every level in the German army lived also with fear of reprisal for failing to work miracles. Fear therefore drove the psychology of communications. Once upon a time, the messengers of bad tidings got beheaded. For our leaders, bad news was to be softened as much as possible. This I cannot tell my boss. Hence, there was an improvement of any message from one level to the next in the command hierarchy, which I saw all the time in reporting combat conditions. After the war, I read that this psychology was practiced by the men reporting to Hitler. Thus, a clear picture was difficult to get in many instances. Communications has its secrets and mysteries. Take one case in Russia. I never wrote bad news to my mother. She was a widow, lived alone, and the radio news from the front was, so I thought, enough for her. I prayed for her and tried to keep her spirit up. After about 3 weeks in the Jelna defense area near Smolensk, I got a letter from her. What happened at this particular time? I could not sleep and went almost crazy. And suddenly, at such and such a time, I was again completely calm. What happened? Turns out she missed the critical time in our withdrawal route from the Yelnya line by a single hour. On what and how much we were told about the progress of the war, let me say that at my level we were never told what to expect. Only at the end did we know for sure what happened. Our incoming information was continuously controlled, and our outgoing was monitored and censored. The daily news we got was very questionable, even suspect. It was only approved news, regardless of whether by newspaper or radio. Everything was propaganda. The truth was hard to come by. The daily radio was the Wehrmachtsbericht, daily but filtered news from the front. This was selective to show the upside, and sometimes it took a long time to get through. In the end, the best news was when some of our radio operators could reach Allied news stations. We had enough people who understood sufficient English. I'm talking about in Italy, to listen to the news and get a few messages beyond what we heard on our own. I know that when we had a good radio at home, we made sure the door was closed, the shades were down, and the volume very, very low as we were listening to the foreign news. Take the total disaster at Stalingrad, for example. I learned the truth about Stalingrad. During the time I had jaundice and received my second Urlaub in 1942. I followed the Stalingrad story, a massive German defeat, at home on the radio. It took a long time for the truth to come out. This was the end of "Do you want to talk of war?" Nobody at this time believed the war was still winnable. After Stalingrad, no one with any intelligence believed that we could win the war. But hope was kept up by talking about the new Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons. Religion was purely personal. I and others prayed privately but never openly. The opportunity to participate in religious services in the German army was relatively poor. We had services at Christmas and Easter, usually at no other times. At that time I was Catholic. We attended the services even when they were of different faiths. Many of the people who attended the services would be those with whom I could talk. It was, so to speak, an identifier. If somebody comes more or less regularly to Christmas and Easter, you can slowly and surely begin to talk about politics. It was a kind of sign of trust. About 1940, the Nazis started to attack the Catholic Church for a short time. This led to passive resistance in many quarters. In the end, we go back to the old saying of soldiers, which was true in the German army. There are no atheists in the trenches. I got paid regularly, and most of the money was transferred to my home address. We carried as many personal articles as we could hide. Officially, we had a tornister, carried on the back, as a knapsack. In our motorized unit, we always had some space to carry a few private things, not many things, mostly books. We took writing paper, but did not use stamps because postage was free. We always could find paper. On campaign, we had toothpaste, a toothbrush, shaving cream, razor blades, soap. Don't ask me about the quality. It was whatever came along. Today you wouldn't touch that kind of quality. But we didn't have to buy them. They were our allotment. We fared pretty well. We also got a daily cigarette ration. We always had a few friends who didn't smoke who would share theirs. For rolling tobacco into cigarettes, we used mostly newspapers. The quality of food in general, like the clothing and personal equipment, accoutrements, was bearable to sufficient. We had in Germany something called the Feldkirchen, a field kitchen. Motorized units put the Feldkirchen on a truck, but it was still the standard model of the Feldkirchen that was developed at the time when we used horses to pull them. We had hot meals in Poland, France, and Italy. Food became cheaper and cheaper in quality. We had no prepared field rations like the US Army's K rations. We ate from the kitchen or foraged on our own. We always could find a chicken, except in Russia in the winter. I was never hungry enough to eat a horse. In Russia, most soldiers carried a bag with potatoes and onions, even frozen. The food supply was often stopped because of impassable roads. The popular drink was coffee from the Feldkirchen, or tea, frequently with rum. Soft drinks were unknown in the army. Our mess gear was the standard metal box with cover and knife, fork and spoon. We were given only one set of uniforms, and didn't always get the uniform replenished while on campaign. The Russian campaign was a completely different story. We got nothing. We had no spare uniforms and had to clean our own uniforms and maintain them as best we could. In the cold weather, in both Russia and Italy, how could you remove your clothing to clean and dry it and try to stay warm? Blankets were hard to find, and after a while, mere threads. When we were back in Germany or Czechoslovakia, we always got new uniforms. We had 3 sets of underwear and 1 set of boots, which we wore until they wore out. These were replenished on campaign. It was absolutely necessary. Believe it or not, we in the artillery wore them out even though we didn't march. We weren't issued socks. We had Fusslappen, a piece of oversized handkerchief put around the feet, army issue instead of socks. We wrapped it around the foot before putting it in the boot. My family sent socks, thank God, for Fusslappen and socks constantly wore out. Mothers are mothers regardless of the war or the army, and will knit socks for their sons. Regarding camp and personal hygiene and sanitation, when you are trained as a little child to keep yourself clean, to go to the toilet, to have a clean shirt, then you always try to do so. I think this holds true for all Western soldiers, regardless of whether German, American, or British. We tried to keep ourselves clean and our hair cut because we were used to it and recognized the obvious benefits from hygiene. Most units had a soldier who did barbering. We dug our latrines and tried to wash ourselves when we could. In the artillery, we spent little time in trenches or foxholes, requiring us to relieve ourselves while remaining in them like the infantry. We did live in bunkers close behind the lines and went outside to the latrines when we could. No matter how hard we tried, the sanitation situation became horrid if we stayed in one place long. The most difficult place, of course, was Russia once our attack stalled. When we advanced in the early campaigns, we were in a hurry, and whatever we did, we left for those who followed. Sorry, but there was no alternative. We used every possibility to bathe in some way, but sometimes all we had was for washing. A full bath was a container of 2 liters of water. We were happy when we could do even this. It was easier to do in Poland and France, and sometimes Sicily and Italy, because of the weather and tempo of battle. Once in a while, some men would bathe in streams or rivers. The general rule was, we tried to maintain a clean appearance even if contrived. This was more for sanitation purposes than for military requirements. We didn't really bathe in the winter, only sponged our hands and faces, sometimes our private parts. In Russia, it was almost impossible to stay clean once the temperature began dropping. There, in order to stay warm, we took all the underwear we had and put it on, one on top of the other. In Russia, we had a lot of lice, and we were practically helpless in fighting the lice. Everywhere a little bit behind the front, there were cleaning stations where occasionally we got sprayed and had a shower bath to get rid of the lice. Entlausungsstellen, delousing organizations, they were called. We had to keep our uniform as clean as possible, especially during the winter. It was practically impossible to use proper hygiene to stay clean, and we smelled like it all the time. We improvised as much as possible, and as artillery soldiers probably didn't have it as bad as the infantry. We had no regular exercise periods because the war itself was exercise enough. A spy of sorts was in every military unit. He was a political educator. We called a Hauswart. The term Hauswart was taken from the organization at home, where every house had such a person as a political observer, mostly the janitor. In the army, he was mostly an old master sergeant. This didn't come about overnight. Slowly and surely, this guy transformed from SA uniform into a regular army uniform. The day before, he had been unable to talk intelligently. Suddenly, he was the representative of the Nazi Party and put political education into army companies. There were 3 rules. Avoid him, if necessary, be friendly, and keep your mouth shut. It worked for me. I never encountered the Gestapo. Once we had to take over a position the SS had conquered, and we had to hold it. The SS had taken off. This was in the Yelnya defense line near Smolensk, and the Russians were beating the shit out of us. As for the SS reputation as good fighters, let's put it this way. The political indoctrination in the SS was obviously much, much stronger than in the army. The political indoctrination in the army, I would say, practically didn't exist. After the fall of France, in the Rheims coffee houses and restaurants, the SS and army officers never mixed. I well remember one instance of being indirectly involved with the SS. In May 1942, Artillery Regiment 109 was in Brno, Czechoslovakia, training recruits. Then came the partisan attack in Prague, when the German High Commissioner in Czechoslovakia, SS General Reinhard Heydrich, was murdered. There was confusion in the compound and an immediate curfew for all soldiers. Next day, we experienced Frontschwein, or front pigs, battle-experienced troops of the 1st Battalion, were loaded onto trucks with our hand weapons. We were driven to the entrance of a small village to search for weapons of the partisans. We could hardly call it a village, ein Dorf, at all. It was really a collection of wine farmers in a valley stretched out over maybe 10 miles. Vineyard-covered hills stretched along the middle and both sides of the valley. Farmers' houses were scattered along both sides of the road. Here and there, tunnelled into the soft hills, were the farmers' wine cellars. We got the order to search the houses and wine cellars for weapons. What an insane idea to send a bunch of combat veteran Viennese soldiers into wine cellars to search for weapons in a Czechoslovakian village, where many Austrians, especially Viennese soldiers, had family origins in Czechoslovakia. And besides, Austrians were not trustworthy anyway. The farmers were not stupid. They invited us to test the wine. So we went from house to house and wine cellar to wine cellar in order to search for weapons, in reality to test the wine. A few hours later, all of us were most happy and drunk. We would not even recognize a gun if we had found one. A SS unit was coming along behind us. Local people tried to keep our men inside their houses so the SS would leave the Czechs alone. It would have been an offence by the SS to check a house that had already been checked by the army. Thus, we marched back to the trucks, and the search was ended, and we received our deserved and definitely needed rest. The overall subject of morale, looking back, is difficult to gauge. I was in so many places, on so many fronts, under such differing circumstances. There were certain things we tried not to talk about. We couldn't say they were idiots and didn't know what they were doing. But most of all, we had to have a positive attitude. If you didn't have a positive attitude, you kept your mouth shut in order not to get into trouble, which is something I learned quickly to do anyway. For example, in Italy in 1945, we had to keep going north. There was no alternative except to surrender, and we all knew the Allies had insisted on unconditional surrender. The idea that something was going bad for the German cause was clear to everybody after Stalingrad. I don't know whether anybody really believed it could be reversed. I doubt it. The American soldier was in a completely different situation. I think the American soldier had an idea that he could win the war. He may have had an ideal or goal to win the war, but on the German side since Stalingrad, survival was the only goal of the individual soldier and the unit, no other goal than survival. On the Italian front against the Americans, the desired situation to come into was where we could capitulate. In Russia, it was a different story. In Russia, it was only if you couldn't move anymore. By the way, I never knew of a German soldier deserting. For God's sake, where would he go? My unit and I were never engaged in close-up combat. I never saw a live enemy soldier face to face, except prisoners of war. Miraculously, I was never wounded. I don't have any idea why not. Everybody else was, it seems. And I was personally shot at only when serving as a forward observer, ahead of or equal to the front lines, and often in an extremely vulnerable position with very high casualty rates. Everything missed me but stirred up dirt and rock around me. I carried the standard issue Mauser infantry rifle all the time, and in Italy also a P-38 pistol. The equipment I used and operated, including the cannons, was of high quality and reliability. The exception was the trucks which I discuss in the chapter on the Russian campaign. Besides being a forward observer and on the calculating team, I served as a telephone wire layer and motorcycle messenger. As an artillery soldier, I am asked about its effect on my hearing. First, earplugs were unknown in the German army. We tried to cover our ears as best we could. I don't know whether my current hearing problem is traceable to the gunfire or not, but I certainly listened to enough cannon fire that it is likely. My unit received no medal or award, but I myself did, like every soldat on the Russian front in the winter of 1941 to 1942. It was Winterorden and the Kriegsverdienstkreuz, the lowest rank of war service medal, and in soldiers' slang what we called the frozen meat medal, or Gefrierfleischorden. It was given to all men who survived the first winter there, but the medal was soon lost after the war. Thanks to my colleague in writing this memoir, who must have visited many flea markets to find it, and that Kodak box camera, I now possess the long-lost frozen meat medal again. I could never bring myself to the point of hating the enemy. Strange, but I understood them better than I understood myself. At the war's end, I felt 100% positive about the Americans. The Germans and Austrians then looked at them as some kind of liberators. They were to me, even though they would detain me for 2 years in a prisoner of war camp. There was absolutely no animosity between the American soldier and the German soldier. I'm saying soldiers. The American political units, the people who came over after the war, had a completely different attitude. They had not fought the war, but they overplayed their roles as victors over the vanquished. The American soldiers we fought showed a mutual respect from soldier to soldier. Perhaps it had something to do with common basic Western cultures, morals, and religions. I tried to be a good soldier and survive and avoid problems. Let's put it this way. In late 1939, early in my army life, I had an experience when we got transferred from Poland to the area of Bonn, Germany. We were at a military training base and suddenly we got the order we could only write open letters. Censorship. I wrote a letter. Dear Mother, I have the honor to write you an open letter because it seems they don't trust the word of a German soldier. This caused me some trouble. Then I learned to keep my mouth closed. Mother had warned me sufficiently, and I should have known better. It was back in March 1938, and the German troops came to take over Austria. It was when Hitler unified the two countries, the Anschluss. We watched. She told me, Franz, please keep your big mouth shut. If you don't do it for yourself, do it for me. I then became paranoid about attacks on freedom. I saw Hitler once in his triumphant march into Vienna after the unification and his oratory in front of the Habsburg Palace. My feelings about the Nazis were all negative. The German army, caught in the middle, tended toward opportunism, but was never dedicated to Hitler. The army overall, and we soldiers individually, always tried to stay at arm's length from Nazi organizations and political units, and the SS in particular. I must comment briefly on Hitler's rule. Today, an American might say the German generals had no guts to stand up to Hitler. But there is something missing, something Americans simply cannot understand. Nobody can understand who wasn't living through this absolute dictatorship, where you were forced to make a decision between truth and your life. This is something I tell people when I talk about Europe in the classroom. Hitler wasn't an idiot. He was crazy, but not an idiot. He did not start by shooting people. In the beginning, for example, let's assume there was a manager of a large factory who was against the Nazis. Hitler didn't shoot this guy. Instead, he promoted him to general manager of a chicken farm on the North Pole. Who wants to be a general manager of a chicken farm on the North Pole? His replacement surely wasn't interested in the same and quickly got the message. This gradual increasing pressure turned the screw slowly and surely. Nobody at the time realized it until it was too late. This exists in no book. There is no analysis. All the world talks about is the atrocities, where they can make a photo, and statistics about the millions.